The sun hung low over the river valley, casting long shadows across the ceremonial clearing where the Redstone hunter-gatherer band had gathered. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their gnarled branches forming a natural canopy that filtered the golden light into dancing patterns on the packed earth below. The air thrummed with tension and anticipation as nearly 40 members of the band formed a wide circle around the sacred fire pit. Kira crouched behind a weathered boulder at the clearing's edge, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her calloused fingers gripped the rough stone as she watched the males of breeding age position themselves near the fire. The ceremony of choosing had begun, and there was nowhere left to run. "You cannot hide forever, sister," whispered Mira, settling beside her with the fluid grace of someone who had survived 30 harsh winters. The older woman's weathered face bore the marks of countless hardships, a jagged scar along her jawline from a cave bear encounter, deep lines etched by wind and sun, and eyes that had seen too much loss. Her thick, dark hair was streaked with premature grey and braided with small bones and polished stones. "The choosing moon rises tonight. You must present yourself." Kira's throat tightened. At 19 summers, she had already survived longer without a mate than most females in the band. Her skill at finding edible roots, medicinal plants, and hidden water sources had made her valuable enough to remain unclaimed, but that protection was ending. The harsh winter ahead would demand strong partnerships for survival, and the band's leaders would no longer allow an unmated female of breeding age to consume resources without contributing to the next generation. "I won't let Grok claim me," she hissed, her brown eyes flashing with defiance. Her lean, muscled frame trembled not with fear, but with barely contained rage. "I'd rather face the ice wolves alone." Mira's expression darkened. Grok stood near the fire's center, his massive frame dominating the space like a boulder in a stream. His thick, sloped shoulders and heavy brow ridge cast deep shadows across his brutal features. Ritual scars crisscrossed his barrel chest, each one marking a successful hunt or defeated rival. His crude spear, tipped with a wickedly sharp obsidian point, rested casually in his grip as his small predatory eyes scanned the gathered females. "He has the strongest claim," Mira admitted reluctantly. 3 mammoth kills this season, 5 cave bear pelts and leadership of the hunting parties. By the old laws, he can choose first. Kira spat into the dirt. The old laws also say a female can refuse if she presents an alternative claim. Her gaze swept desperately across the circle of males. Most were already paired or too old, too young, or too weak to challenge Grok's dominance. Her options were vanishing like morning mist. That's when she noticed him. Thane sat alone at the very edge of the circle, so still he might have been carved from stone. Where Grok was massive and imposing, Thane appeared almost fragile. His frame leaned to the point of gauntness, his dark hair hanging in unkempt tangles around a face marked by old sorrow. His clothes were little more than patched furs and worn hides, and his bare arms showed the prominent ribs of someone who often went without food. Most of the band barely acknowledged his presence, treating him like a shadow that happened to share their fire. But Kira had watched him, had seen things others missed. The way he moved through the forest without breaking a twig, how his dark eyes tracked every sound, every movement, cataloguing threats and opportunities with predatory awareness. The mysterious scars that covered his lean torso, not random wounds but precise marks that spoke of countless battles survived. There was something about Thane that didn't match his reputation as the band's weakest member. "What about him?" she whispered, nodding toward the solitary figure. Mira followed her gaze and scoffed. "Thane? Child, he can barely keep himself fed. He contributes nothing to the band except another mouth that needs feeding. Grok tolerates him only because—" She paused, her expression growing troubled. "Because of what happened before you came to us." "What happened?" "That's not for me to tell, but choosing Thane would be madness. He has no status, no hunting prowess, no strength to protect you. The band would cast you both out before the first snow." Kira's mind raced. The ceremony was beginning in earnest now. Elder Corvin, the band's eldest male at nearly 50 winters, stepped forward with his ceremonial staff carved from mammoth bone. His voice, still strong despite his age, rang across the clearing. "By fire and blood, by stone and bone, we gather under the choosing moon," he intoned. "Let those who would claim speak now that the band may survive another winter." Grok moved first, his massive form stepping into the firelight with confident swagger. "I claim Kira of the Redstone Band," he announced, his voice a rumbling growl. "By right of strength, By right of the hunt, by right of protection. A murmur rippled through the gathered hunters. It was traditional for the strongest male to claim the most valuable unmated female, but there was something in Grok's tone, a possessiveness, that made several of the older women exchange worried glances. Kira rose on trembling legs, knowing she had only moments before custom demanded her submission, her desperate gaze fixed on Thane, who hadn't moved or acknowledged the proceedings. In the flickering firelight, his profile looked almost noble, like the carved totems the band's artisans made to honor great hunters of the past. "I invoke the right of alternative claim," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent clearing. Grok's face darkened with rage. "There is no male here strong enough to challenge my claim." Kira's heart hammered as she stepped fully into the circle, feeling the weight of 40 pairs of eyes upon her. The firelight danced across her own features, high cheekbones, determined jaw, and eyes that blazed with desperate courage. Her lean body, hardened by years of foraging and surviving, stood defiantly in the ceremonial space. "I choose Thane," she declared. The clearing erupted in shocked murmurs and derisive laughter. Grok's expression shifted from rage to cruel amusement. "The outcast," he sneered. "You would choose the weakest among us over the strongest? Very well. Let him accept your claim if he dares." All eyes turned to Thane. For a long moment he remained motionless, his face hidden in shadow. Then slowly he raised his head, and Kira caught her breath. His eyes, dark as a moonless night but burning with some inner fire, met hers across the circle. In that gaze she glimpsed something that made her pulse quicken. Not weakness, but a carefully controlled power that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. Without a word, Thane rose to his feet and stepped into the firelight beside her. Up close, Kira could see the lean muscle that corded his arms, the way he moved with a predator's fluid grace, despite his apparent frailty. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the hushed clearing. "I accept her claim." Before anyone could react, before second thoughts could paralyze her, Kira stepped forward and pressed her lips to his in the ritual kiss that would bind them, according to the ancient laws. The contact sent an unexpected shock through her. His lips were warm, gentle, but there was something else there, a barely restrained intensity that made her knees weak. When they parted, she found herself staring into those dark eyes, seeing depths she hadn't expected. For just a moment she forgot the ceremony, forgot the watching crowd, forgot everything except the strange connection that seemed to arc between them like lightning. Then Grok's roar of fury shattered the moment, and Kira remembered exactly what she had just done. The silence that followed Grok's roar stretched like a taut sinew, ready to snap. The massive hunter's face contorted with a rage so profound it seemed to darken the very air around him. His thick fingers tightened on his spear shaft until the seasoned wood creaked under the pressure, and the ritual scars across his chest seemed to writhe in the dancing firelight. "This is madness," he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "You mock the sacred laws, girl. No female chooses weakness over strength. No female chooses death over life." Kira stood her ground beside Thane, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. She could feel the lean hunter's presence beside her like a coiled spring, and something about his stillness gave her courage. When she spoke, her voice carried across the clearing with surprising steadiness. "The law is clear, Grok. I have made my choice according to the ancient ways. Thane has accepted. The binding is complete." Elder Corvin stepped forward, his weathered face grave with concern. The ceremonial staff trembled slightly in his gnarled hands as he looked between the unlikely pair and the enraged hunter. At nearly 50 winters, he had seen many ceremonies, but nothing like this defiant display. "The law is indeed clear," he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom and survival. "But child, do you understand what you have done? Winter approaches, and survival demands the strongest partnerships. Your choice may doom you both to exile, or worse." Grok's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone. Exile would be mercy. He took a menacing step forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the firelit ground. "I could challenge the weakling here and now. End this mockery with blood on sacred earth." "You could," came a quiet voice that somehow cut through the tension like an obsidian blade. Everyone turned to stare at Thane, who had spoken for the second time that night. He stood with his head slightly tilted, studying Grok with those unsettling dark eyes. In the firelight, his lean face looked almost gaunt, but there was something in his expression, a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, That made several of the elder hunters shift uncomfortably. "But you won't," Thane continued, his voice still soft but carrying an undertone that raised the hair on Kira's arms. "Because even you remember the old laws about challenging a newly bonded pair. The spirits of the ancestors would curse any who spill blood on ceremony night." Grok's face flushed darker, but he didn't advance. Ancient superstitions ran deep in the band, and even the strongest hunter feared the wrath of the dead. Instead, he pointed his spear at Thane's chest, close enough that the obsidian tip nearly touched the thin hide of his tunic. "You think the spirits protect cowards, outcast? Tomorrow, when the ceremony moon sets, you'll have no such protection. I'll hunt you down like the weak prey you are." "Perhaps," Thane replied with that same unnerving calm. "But tonight, I am bound to Kira by law and custom, and tonight is all that matters." The cryptic response sent a ripple of unease through the watching crowd. Jorik, a scarred hunter with a partially healed leg wound, limped closer to the fire. His weathered face bore the marks of countless hunts and battles, and his eyes held a knowledge that made Kira wonder what history existed between these men. "Enough," Jorik said, his voice rough from old throat wounds. "The choosing is complete. Let the bonded pairs prepare their shelters for winter. Dawn brings new hunts, new challenges." Grok whirled on the older hunter, his rage finding a new target. "You support this mockery, Jorik, you who once hunted beside the strongest." Jorik's scarred face remained impassive, but Kira caught something, a quick glance toward Thane that held recognition, perhaps even respect. "I support the law," he said simply. "As should you if you truly lead our hunts." The implicit challenge in those words made Grok's jaw clench, but he couldn't argue with the logic. To openly defy the band's ancient laws would undermine his own authority. Instead, he turned his burning gaze back to Kira and Thane. "So be it," he snarled. "But understand this, both of you. The band will not waste resources on the weak. You'll get no share of the winter stores, no place in the main shelters, no protection from what prowls in the dark season. Your choice tonight may feel like victory, but it will taste like death before the spring thaw." With that, he spun on his heel and stalked away, his supporters following like a pack of wolves. The remaining members of the band began to disperse, shooting curious and worried glances at the unlikely pair still standing by the sacred fire. Mira approached them, her face etched with concern and something that might have been regret. She looked at Kira with the expression of a mother watching her child walk willingly into a cave bear's den. "Child, what have you done?" she whispered. "Grok spoke truth. The band will not support you through winter. And Thane." She glanced at the silent hunter with undisguised skepticism. "How will he provide for you when he can barely feed himself?" Kira felt the first tremor of doubt creep into her chest. In her desperation to avoid Grok's brutal claim, had she chosen a slower, more certain death? She looked at Thane, searching his gaunt face for some sign of the strength she thought she'd glimpsed earlier. "I'll manage," Thane said quietly, his dark eyes meeting Mira's gaze steadily. "Kira will not starve while I draw breath." Mira studied him for a long moment, and again Kira caught that flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or buried memory. The older woman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly before she shook her head and turned away. "Come," she said to Kira, "help me gather your belongings. If you're determined to follow this path, you'll need every fur and tool you possess." As Mira led her toward the sleeping areas, Kira glanced back at Thane. He remained by the dying fire, standing perfectly still as he watched the shadows beyond the clearing. In the flickering orange light, his profile looked almost regal, and for a moment she could imagine him as something more than the band's outcast. But when a distant howl echoed from the dark forest, the hunting call of wolves beginning their nightly hunt, she saw him stiffen slightly, his head turning toward the sound with the alertness of a predator recognizing a rival. For just an instant, in the play of firelight and shadow, Thane looked like exactly what Grok claimed to be, an apex hunter surveying his domain. Then the moment passed, and he was just a thin, ragged man preparing to face a winter that might kill them both. Elder Corvin approached him as the clearing emptied, his ancient face troubled. "You play a dangerous game, young one," he said softly. "Grok's rage will not cool with the morning sun." Thane turned those unsettling dark eyes on the elder, and his slight smile returned. "I know," he replied simply, "but some games are worth playing." The shelter Thane led her to lay at the very edge of the band's territory, where the protective circle of firelight barely reached, and the ancient oaks gave way to dense undergrowth. It was little more than a lean-to built against a massive fallen log, its roof of woven branches and mud barely large enough for 2 people. Dried leaves and animal bones scattered the ground nearby, and the whole area had the neglected look of a place where someone merely survived rather than lived. Kira clutched her bundle of possessions, 2 worn fur blankets, a bone needle, a small pot, and her precious collection of plant-gathering tools, as she surveyed what would be her home until spring, if she lived that long. "I know it's not much," Thane said quietly, seeming to read her thoughts. In the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy, his gaunt face looked almost spectral. "But it's sheltered from the worst winds, and there's a small spring just beyond those rocks." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that the adrenaline of the ceremony was fading, the full weight of her decision pressed down on her like a stone. She had bound herself to a man she barely knew, a man the entire band considered worthless, a man who might not be able to keep either of them alive through the brutal winter ahead. As if sensing her doubts, Thane moved to a pile of apparently random debris near the shelter's entrance. But as Kira watched, his hands moved with practiced efficiency, uncovering carefully hidden supplies, a stack of properly cured hides, several bundles of dried meat wrapped in bark, clay pots containing rendered fat and preserved berries, a collection of stone tools that, even in the poor light, looked far superior to anything she'd seen him use publicly. "How?" she began, then stopped as understanding dawned. "You've been preparing for 3 seasons, he confirmed, his voice matter-of-fact, since the signs began pointing to a harsh winter. While Grok and his hunters focused on their glory kills, I've been gathering what we'd actually need to survive." Kira stared at the carefully organized supplies, her mind reeling. This wasn't the work of the band's weakest member. This was the methodical preparation of someone who understood survival at a level most hunters never reached. She looked at Thane with new eyes, seeing the lean muscle she'd missed before, the calloused hands that spoke of constant work, the way he moved through his domain with quiet confidence. "You're not what you pretend to be," she said softly. Something flickered in his dark eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the shadow of an old wound. "None of us are entirely what we seem, Kira, but some masks are necessary for survival." Before she could question him further, a rustling in the nearby undergrowth made them both freeze. Thane's transformation was instant and startling. His entire body went rigid with alertness, his head tilting to track sounds she couldn't even hear. His hand moved with fluid grace to a stone axe she hadn't noticed before, and in that moment, he looked nothing like the band's outcast. He looked like a hunter. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Don't move, don't breathe loudly, don't make any sound at all." Then he melted into the shadows with such complete silence that Kira wondered if she'd imagined his presence. She crouched behind the fallen log, her heart hammering as she strained to hear anything over the normal forest sounds. An owl called from somewhere overhead, leaves rustled in the night breeze, and then, so faint she almost missed it, came the soft whimper of something young and afraid. Thane emerged from the darkness, carrying a small bundle of fur that squirmed weakly in his arms. As he moved into the moonlight, Kira saw it was a wolf pup, probably no more than 8 weeks old, with dark grey fur and bright amber eyes that reflected the scattered starlight. "Its pack was taken by the fever sickness," he explained, settling beside her with the trembling creature. "I've been watching it for 2 days, waiting to see if any survivors would claim it." Kira stared at him in amazement. "You've been caring for a wolf pup?" "All young things deserve a chance to grow strong," he replied, gently stroking the pup's fur as it calmed in his arms. "Besides, wolves remember kindness. In a harsh winter, that memory might mean the difference between survival and death." As if to prove his point, the pup's tiny tail wagged tentatively, and it nuzzled against Thane's chest with obvious trust. The sight of this supposedly weak man holding the wild creature with such gentle care made something shift inside Kira's chest. "What's its name?" she found herself asking. "Names have power," Thane said seriously. "They bind spirits to the living world. I was waiting to see if it would survive before giving it that kind of anchor." He looked at her with those unreadable dark eyes. "Perhaps that choice should belong to both of us now." The simple statement carried unexpected weight. He was asking her to share in something important, to help him make a decision that would affect all 3 of them. It was a small thing, but it felt like the first real partnership she'd ever been offered. "Shadow," she said without hesitation. "Its fur matches the darkness, and it came to us from the shadows between worlds." Thane nodded approvingly. "Shadow." As he spoke the name, the pup's ears perked up, as if it recognized the sound as its own. Yes, that fits. They worked together to prepare a small nest for the pup near their sleeping area, using soft furs and dried grass. As they moved around each other in the confined space, Kira began to notice things she'd missed before. The way Thane's lean frame moved with efficient grace. How his hands, though thin, were strong and sure as they arranged their supplies. The network of scars that crossed his arms and torso, not random wounds, but the deliberate marks of countless battles, survived. "Thane," she said, as they settled down for the night, shadow curled between them like a small, warm anchor. "What happened to you before tonight, I mean?" Mira said there was something the band doesn't talk about. For a long moment he was silent. The night sounds of the forest filled the space between them. The distant call of hunting owls, the rustle of small creatures moving through the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through ancient leaves. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she had to strain to hear it. "I was the Alpha once," he said simply. 3 winters ago, I led the hunt, commanded the warriors, chose the strategies that kept this band alive through the hardest season any of us had seen." Kira's breath caught. What happened?" "I failed them," he continued, his voice carrying a weight of pain that made her chest ache. "Led a hunting party into a trap set by the rival Blackstone band. 7 hunters went out that day. Only 3 came back alive, and one of those, Jorik, will never hunt the same way again." The pieces began falling into place. Jorik's scarred leg, the way some of the older hunters looked at Thane with something that wasn't quite contempt, the carefully hidden respect she'd glimpsed in a few weathered faces. "The band blamed you?" "They should have," Thane said with bitter certainty. "I was their leader. Their survival was my responsibility. When I failed them so completely, I stepped aside and let Grok take my place. It was justice." "But you're still here," Kira pointed out. "They didn't exile you." "Exile would have been kinder," he admitted. "Instead, I chose to remain as a reminder of what happens when a leader's judgment fails, a living warning against the pride that led to disaster." Shadow whimpered softly in his sleep, and Thane's hand automatically moved to comfort the pup. The gesture was so gentle, so protective, that Kira felt her heart twist with unexpected emotion. "That's why you hid your true skills," she realized. "Why you let everyone think you were weak. Strength that leads to death is worse than weakness that leads to survival," he said. "At least that's what I told myself for 3 long winters." Kira studied his profile in the dim light, seeing not the broken outcast the band believed him to be, but a man carrying a burden of guilt so heavy it had nearly crushed his spirit. A leader who had punished himself more severely than his people ever could. "And tonight?" she asked softly. "When you accepted my claim?" Thane was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held a note she hadn't heard before, something that might have been hope, fragile as a bird's egg, but unmistakably present. "Tonight, for the first time in 3 winters, someone chose me not despite my failures, but without even knowing them. You saw something in me worth saving, even when I'd forgotten it existed." He turned to look at her, and in his dark eyes she saw depths of pain and determination that took her breath away. "I won't fail you, Kira. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to become again, I won't let winter claim you." Dawn broke grey and bitter over the valley, carrying the sharp scent of coming winter on its breath. Kira woke to find frost coating the outside of their crude shelter, and Shadow pressed against her side for warmth, his small body trembling despite the thick furs. But Thane was gone. She sat up quickly, scanning their small camp with growing alarm. His weapons were missing, along with the worn hunting pack he'd kept hidden beneath a pile of seemingly worthless debris. The carefully banked coals of their fire had been stirred to life and fed with dry wood, suggesting he'd been gone for some time but had ensured she'd wake to warmth. "Where did he go, Shadow?" she whispered to the pup, who lifted his head to regard her with those startling amber eyes. The young wolf whined softly and padded to the shelter's entrance, sniffing at tracks she couldn't see in the hard-packed earth. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart leap with relief, but it was Mira who emerged from the morning mist, not Thane. The older woman's face was grim with worry as she approached their meager camp. "Child, where is your bondmate?" The slight hesitation before the formal term spoke volumes about Mira's opinion of the arrangement. "I don't know," Kira admitted, wrapping a fur around her shoulders against the morning chill. "He was gone when I woke. Did something happen?" Mira's weathered features darkened further. "Grok took the dawn hunting party out early, claiming the need to bring back meat before the first snows. But everyone knows he's hunting for more than deer." She paused meaningfully. "Jorik tried to join them, but Grok refused him, saying his lame leg would slow the hunt. Ice that had nothing to do with the morning frost formed in Kira's stomach. You think Grok is hunting Thane? I think Grok is a hunter who's never learned the difference between prey and rival, Mira replied carefully, and I think your bondmate may have walked into something he's not prepared for. But even as the words left her lips, something in Mira's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of Thane's helplessness. Kira remembered the older woman's strange looks the night before, the way she'd studied Thane as if trying to recall something important. A distant howl echoed from deep in the forest, not the hunting cry of wolves, but something else. Something that made Shadow's ears prick forward with alert attention and sent a chill down Kira's spine. That's not a wolf, she said with certainty. Mira nodded grimly. No, that's the call sign Jorik taught the hunters 3 winters ago. The signal for enemy sighted. Her eyes met Kira's with sudden urgency, which means either Grok's party has found the Blackstone raiders we've been tracking, or they've found Thane, Kira finished. Without thinking, she grabbed her gathering pack and the small flint knife that was her only real weapon. Shadow bounded to his feet, his puppy awkwardness giving way to something that looked remarkably like purpose. Where are you going? Mira demanded as Kira headed toward the forest. To find my bondmate. Child, you can't track armed hunters through unknown territory. You're a forager, not a warrior. Kira paused at the tree line, her hand resting on Shadow's head. The pup looked up at her with those intelligent amber eyes, and she could swear she saw understanding there, and agreement. Maybe, she said quietly, but I know these forests as well as any hunter. I know where the deer paths lead, where the water runs clean, where predators make their dens, and I know Thane better than Grok does. Before Mira could argue further, Kira plunged into the undergrowth with Shadow at her heels. The wolf pup moved through the forest with surprising grace, his nose working constantly as he helped her follow a trail she couldn't see but somehow felt. They traveled for nearly 2 hours, moving deeper into territory the band rarely explored. Here the ancient trees grew so thick, their canopy blocked most of the morning light, creating a twilight world of shadows and whispered sounds. Kira's foraging instincts served her well, guiding her around patches of treacherous bog and past the territorial markers of creatures she had no desire to meet. It was Shadow who first caught the scent. The pup's entire body went rigid, his hackles rising as a low growl rumbled in his small chest. Kira crouched beside him, following his gaze toward a natural clearing ahead, where shafts of sunlight pierced the forest canopy. The scene that greeted her eyes made her blood run cold. Grok and 5 of his hunters had formed a rough circle in the clearing's center. Their spears were lowered in the universal position of predators, closing for the kill, and their faces bore the savage expressions of men anticipating violence. In the center of their trap, Thane stood perfectly still beside the carcass of a massive elk, his hands empty of weapons, his posture deceptively relaxed. But Kira's sharp eyes caught what the hunters had missed. Scattered around the clearing's edge lay the results of Thane's morning hunt, not just the elk but 2 deer, several fat rabbits, and what looked like enough meat to feed the entire band for days. This wasn't the desperate scavenging of a weak man. This was the systematic harvest of a master hunter who understood the forest like few others ever could. Look what we found, brothers. Grok's voice carried clearly across the clearing. The outcast, stealing from the band's hunting grounds, taking meat that should belong to stronger hands. Thane's response was so quiet Kira had to strain to hear it. These aren't the band's grounds, Grok. We're 3 valleys beyond our traditional territory. All grounds belong to the strong, Grok snarled, taking a step closer. His massive spear glinted in the dappled sunlight. And you are not strong. You are nothing. A failure who should have died with honor instead of living with shame. Perhaps, Thane replied with that same unnerving calm Kira remembered from the ceremony. But dead men can't provide for their bondmates. The casual reference to their binding sent Grok into a rage. His knuckles whitened on his spear shaft as he raised it to striking position. Your bondmate will be a widow before the sun reaches its peak, he roared, and then she'll learn what it means to belong to a true hunter. That was when Thane smiled. It wasn't the gentle expression Kira had seen in their shelter, or the pained grimace that had crossed his face when speaking of his past failures. This smile was predatory, cold as winter ice, and filled with a promise of violence that made even Grok's hunters shift uneasily. You want to know what happened 3 winters ago, Grok? Thane's voice carried a new note, authority so absolute it seemed to change the very air around him. Why I really stepped down as Alpha. His hand moved to his side, and Kira gasped as she saw what he drew. Not the crude stone axe she'd seen him carry, but a weapon that looked like it had been forged by master craftsmen. The obsidian blade was longer than her forearm, its edge so sharp it seemed to cut the light itself. The handle was carved from some dark wood she didn't recognize, and wrapped with leather that had been stained dark with old blood. "It wasn't because I was weak," Thane continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the clearing. "It was because I was too strong, because when I led with my full power, people died. Good people, people I cared about." He began to move, and Kira felt her breath catch. Gone was the hesitant shuffle of the band's outcast. In its place was the fluid, deadly grace of a predator in its prime. Thane circled the hunters like a wolf stalking prey, and she saw the exact moment when Grok's confidence began to crack. "I chose weakness because strength had cost me too much," Thane said, his dark eyes never leaving Grok's face. "But you've made a mistake, brother. You've threatened what belongs to me, and that's a line I will not let anyone cross." The attack, when it came, was so swift Kira almost missed it. One moment Thane was standing motionless in the center of the circle. The next, he was moving like liquid lightning. His obsidian blade caught one hunter's spear and spun it away with contemptuous ease. His free hand struck another's throat with surgical precision, dropping the man to his knees, gasping for air. By the time the remaining hunters could react, Thane was behind them, his blade at Grok's throat, his other arm wrapped around the massive hunter's chest in a hold that spoke of absolute control. "Drop your weapons," he commanded, and his voice carried the authority of a true alpha, not the brutal dominance Grok wielded, but the natural leadership of someone born to command. "All of you, now." The spears hit the ground with a sound like breaking bones. From her hiding place, Kira stared in amazement at this transformation. This was the man she'd bound herself to, not the broken outcast, but the hunter who had once led the band through their darkest winter. The alpha who had stepped aside not from weakness, but from a strength too terrible to unleash without cost. And now that strength was hers to share. The silence in the clearing stretched taut as a bowstring. Grok's massive frame trembled with rage, and something else, fear perhaps, or the dawning recognition of a predator far more dangerous than himself. The obsidian blade at his throat remained perfectly steady, its razor edge drawing a thin line of blood where it pressed against his skin. "You remember now, don't you, brother?" Thane's voice was soft, almost conversational, but it carried an undertone that made the fallen hunter's eyes widen with terror. "You remember why the elders chose me to lead, not you. Why even the fiercest warriors followed my commands without question." Grok's jaw worked soundlessly, his small eyes darting toward his fallen spear just beyond reach. Thane noticed the movement and pressed the blade a fraction deeper, causing the larger man to freeze. "I could end this now," Thane continued, his dark eyes meeting each of the hunter's gazes in turn. "One quick cut, and the band would have no choice but to accept my leadership again. It would solve many problems." From her hiding place, Kira held her breath. Shadow pressed against her leg, the pup's entire body vibrating with tension, as if he sensed the violence hanging in the air like storm clouds. "But that would make me the same kind of leader you are, Grok," Thane said finally. "The kind who rules through fear and death, and I've seen where that path leads." With fluid grace, he stepped back and lowered his weapon. Grok stumbled forward, his hand flying to his throat where a thin trickle of blood marked the blade's kiss. The massive hunter spun around, his face contorted with humiliation and rage. "You think mercy makes you strong?" Grok snarled, reaching for his spear. "You think—" The words died in his throat as Thane's blade whistled through the air, embedding itself in a tree trunk barely a hand's span from Grok's head. The obsidian had cut so cleanly through the seasoned wood that it might have been soft clay. "My mercy isn't for you," Thane said quietly, drawing a second blade from his pack, this one smaller but no less deadly. "It's for them." He nodded toward the fallen hunters, who were slowly getting to their feet. "These men have families to feed, children to protect. Their deaths would serve no purpose except satisfying my anger." He stepped closer to Grok, who had gone very still. "But understand this, brother. If you threaten Kira again, if you even look at her wrong, there will be no mercy, no hesitation, no chance for you to beg or bargain or run. Do you understand me?" Grok's face cycled through several expressions: rage, humiliation, calculation, and finally, a grudging recognition of superior force. He gave a curt nod. "Good." Thane retrieved his embedded blade with a casual yank that spoke of tremendous strength hidden in his lean frame. "Now take your hunters and return to the band. Tell them what you found here, All of it. Let them decide for themselves what it means. As the hunters gathered their weapons and began filing out of the clearing, one of them, a young man named Bren, paused beside the elk carcass. His eyes moved from the perfectly placed kill shots to Thane's collection of hunting tools, and his expression shifted from fear to something approaching awe. "The stories were true," he said softly, "about the winter when you brought down 3 cave bears in a single day, about the mammoth hunt where you saved Elder Corvin's son." Thane's expression softened slightly. "Stories grow in the telling, Bren. I did what needed doing, nothing more." "And now?" the young hunter asked. "What happens when we return to the band?" "That depends on your people," Thane replied. "I won't seek leadership again. I won't challenge Grok's authority unless he forces my hand, but I won't hide what I am anymore either. The band will have to decide if they can accept that." After the hunters vanished into the forest, Kira emerged from her hiding place with Shadow at her heels. Thane turned at the sound of their approach, and she saw his entire demeanor shift again, from the deadly Alpha back to the gentle man who had comforted a frightened wolf pup. "You followed me," he said, but there was no anger in his voice. If anything, he sounded impressed. "I was worried," she admitted, studying his face for signs of the predator she'd just witnessed. But his dark eyes held only warmth and a trace of concern. "Mira said Grok might be hunting you." "He was." Thane began efficiently field-dressing the elk, his movements quick and sure. "But not for the reasons he claimed. Grok's always known I could challenge him if I chose to. Today's hunt was meant to eliminate that possibility permanently." Kira watched him work, noting the skill in every cut, the way he wasted nothing and preserved everything useful. "But you didn't eliminate him when you had the chance. Why?" Thane paused in his work, considering the question. "Because leadership taken by force rarely lasts, and because—" He met her eyes, and she saw depths of pain and wisdom that made her chest ache. "Because I learned 3 winters ago that being the strongest doesn't make you right. Sometimes it just makes you dangerous." They worked together to prepare the meat for transport, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Shadow helped by alerting them to the approach of scavengers, his sharp senses proving invaluable in the deep forest. As they worked, Kira found herself studying Thane with new eyes. "Is this who you really are?" she asked finally. "The hunter I just saw, or the man who feeds wolf pups?" "Both," he said simply. "The hunter is what I was born to be. The gentle man is what I chose to become. And you, Kira of the Redstone Band, are the first person to see value in both versions of me." The simple honesty in his voice made something flutter in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with recognition. She was beginning to understand that her desperate choice at the ceremony might have been the smartest decision she'd ever made. They were loading the last of the meat onto improvised carrying frames when Jorik appeared at the clearing's edge. The scarred hunter moved with the careful gait of a man whose injured leg would never fully heal, but his eyes were alert and knowing as they took in the scene. "So," he said without preamble, "the Alpha returns." Thane straightened, his expression guarded. "I'm not seeking to reclaim anything, old friend." "Maybe not," Jorik agreed, settling against a tree with a grunt of pain. "But seeking and accepting are different things. The band is talking, Thane." Grok's men returned with interesting stories. "What kind of stories?" Jorik's scarred face split in a grin that held years of shared battles and mutual respect. "The kind that remind people why they followed you through the worst winter in living memory. The kind that make them remember you never asked for glory, only survival for the people you protected." He gestured toward the pile of meat and hides they'd prepared. "And the kind that show you can still provide for the band better than any hunter alive." Thane was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant with thought. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of reluctant acceptance. "The band will choose their own path. I won't force anything on them." "No," Jorik agreed, struggling to his feet. "But you won't hide from them anymore either, and that might be enough." As the scarred hunter disappeared back into the forest, Kira found herself looking at Thane with new understanding. He wasn't just a fallen leader trying to reclaim his position. He was a man who had punished himself so severely for past failures that he'd forgotten his own worth, but she was beginning to remember it for him. "Come," she said, shouldering her pack. "Let's take this meat back to the band. It's time for them to see who they really cast aside." Thane smiled, the first truly happy expression she'd seen cross his face, and together they began the journey home. The band's reaction to their return was like watching a stone dropped into still water, ripples of shock, and recognition spreading outward in ever-widening circles. Thane and Kira emerged from the forest, carrying enough fresh meat to feed everyone for days, their improvised frames laden with perfectly butchered elk, deer, and smaller game. But it wasn't the abundance of food that made the gathered hunters stop their evening tasks and stare. It was the way Thane moved. Gone was the shuffling, hesitant gait of the band's outcast. In its place was the fluid confidence of a master predator, each step precise and purposeful. His lean frame seemed to have gained substance somehow, as if casting off the disguise of weakness had revealed the true power beneath. Eve and Shadow trotted beside him with obvious pride, the wolf pup's amber eyes alert and intelligent as they surveyed the watching crowd. Elder Corvin rose from his place by the main fire, his ancient eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. The ceremonial staff in his gnarled hands trembled slightly. Whether from age or emotion, Kira couldn't tell. "By the ancestors," the old man whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness. "The hunter returns." Grok stood at the far edge of the gathering, his massive frame rigid with barely controlled rage. The thin line of dried blood on his throat caught the firelight like a warning, and his small eyes burned with the fury of a predator who had discovered he was prey. The hunters who had witnessed the morning's confrontation clustered near him, their faces showing a mixture of fear and something that might have been relief. "Tell them, Grok," Thane said quietly, his voice carrying the natural authority that had once commanded absolute obedience. "Tell them what you found in the forest." The massive hunter's jaw worked silently for a moment, his pride warring with the undeniable evidence before them all. Finally, he spat into the dirt at his feet. "He hunts well enough," Grok admitted grudgingly. "The meat is good." A murmur ran through the gathered band members. Coming from Grok, even such faint praise was significant, but it was young Bren who stepped forward, his voice carrying the excitement of someone sharing an incredible truth. "It's more than that," he said, ignoring Grok's thunderous glare. "I've never seen hunting like this. Clean kills, perfect preservation, enough meat for days from a single morning's work, and when Grok tried to—" He faltered under the larger hunter's murderous stare. "When I tried to what?" Grok snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward his spear. Thane stepped forward, not threatening, but the simple movement made every warrior in the circle tense with anticipation. "When you tried to kill me," he said calmly, "as was your right according to the old laws of challenge, but you failed, brother, and now the band knows what that means." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone understood the implications. If Grok couldn't defeat Thane even with superior numbers and the advantage of surprise, what did that say about their current leadership? More importantly, what did it mean for their survival in the harsh winter ahead? It was Mira who broke the tension, moving forward to examine the meat with the practiced eye of someone who had prepared countless meals for the hungry band. "This will feed us for 3 days, she announced, her voice filled with genuine amazement. "Maybe 4 if we're careful with the portions." She looked at Thane with an expression that held years of buried recognition. "I remember now why the elders chose you to lead us through the great winter. You never hunted for glory, only for survival." One by one, other band members began to step forward. Mothers whose children had grown thin during the recent lean times reached out to touch the fresh meat with reverent fingers. Elders nodded with approval at the careful preservation techniques. Even some of Grok's most loyal hunters began to look thoughtful as they considered what they were seeing. But it was little Nala who provided the moment that changed everything. The orphaned girl, no more than 7 summers old, approached Thane with the fearless curiosity of childhood. She had been watching Shadow with obvious delight, and now she knelt before the wolf pup with her small hands extended. "Is he tame?" she asked, her young voice piping clear in the evening air. Thane knelt beside her, his expression gentling as it had in the forest shelter. "Not tame," he corrected softly, "but he remembers kindness. Shadow lost his pack to the fever sickness, just as you lost your parents. Sometimes those who have known loss recognize each other." The pup approached Nala cautiously, sniffing her outstretched fingers before allowing her to stroke his dark fur. The child's delighted laughter rang across the clearing, and several of the watching adults smiled despite the tension. "You see?" called out a voice from the crowd. It was Vera, an elderly woman whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharper memory. "This is what a true leader looks like. Not someone who rules through fear and brutality, but someone who protects the helpless and provides for all." Grok's face darkened further. Pretty words from an old woman who's never faced a charging mammoth or rival warriors. Leadership requires strength, not sentiment. "And what is strength?" Elder Corvin asked, his ancient voice carrying the weight of decades. He stepped into the circle's center, his ceremonial staff planted firmly in the earth. Is it the ability to kill, to dominate through fear, or is it the wisdom to know when violence serves the band and when it destroys it? The old man's eyes found Thane's across the flickering firelight. 3 winters ago, I supported your decision to step aside. You had led us through our darkest season, but the cost, he shook his head sadly, the cost was written in your eyes, in the way you carried the weight of every loss. I thought rest would heal those wounds. And did it? Thane asked quietly. Corvin studied him for a long moment, taking in the subtle changes that marked this transformation from broken outcast to confident hunter. No, he said finally. Rest didn't heal you, but perhaps accepting help did. The elder's gaze shifted to Kira, and she felt the full weight of his ancient wisdom focusing on her. The ceremony 2 nights ago wasn't about choosing the strongest mate, was it, child? It was about choosing the partner who would help you both become what you needed to be. Kira felt heat rise in her cheeks as dozens of eyes turned toward her. But when she looked at Thane, she saw only encouragement and something that might have been gratitude. I chose him because he was the only one who looked like he needed choosing, she said honestly. But I stayed because he's the only one who's ever treated me like an equal partner, rather than a prize to be claimed. A murmur of approval ran through several of the women in the crowd, and Kira noticed that even some of the hunters were nodding thoughtfully. The idea of partnership rather than dominance was not entirely foreign to the band's culture, but it had been forgotten during Grok's brutal reign. Partnership, Grok sneered. Weakness dressed in pretty words. When the Blackstone Raiders come, when the Ice Wolves hunt our children, when starvation stalks our fires, will partnership keep us alive, or will strength? Both, Thane said simply. Strength without wisdom is just destruction. Wisdom without strength is just words. But together, he looked at Kira, and she saw the truth of their growing bond reflected in his dark eyes. Together they might be enough to see us through whatever comes. Jorik limped into the circle's center, his scarred face grave with memory. I was there 3 winters ago, he said, his rough voice carrying clearly. I saw what happened when Thane led with nothing but strength. Good hunters died because he forgot that being the deadliest predator doesn't make you the wisest leader. He turned to face the gathered band, his injured leg forcing him to lean heavily on his walking stick. But I also saw what happened when he learned that lesson. The great winter, when the snow fell for 60 days without stopping, when the mammoth herds moved south and the rivers froze solid, we survived because he had learned to balance strength with mercy, hunting with wisdom. The scarred hunter's eyes found Grok's. And we've been forgetting those lessons ever since. The challenge in those words was unmistakable, and Grok's face twisted with fury. His hand closed around his spear shaft, and for a moment it seemed violence would erupt in the sacred circle. But then Shadow did something unexpected. The wolf pup, still being petted by young Nala, lifted his head and let out a long, mournful howl that seemed to pierce the night air like a blade. The sound was answered from the dark forest beyond, first one voice, then another, until a chorus of wild wolves sang their ancient song to the rising moon. In that moment, surrounded by the voices of the wilderness and the flickering light of the sacred fire, the gathered band members seemed to remember something fundamental about their place in the world. They were not the forest's masters, but its children, not conquerors but survivors who depended on wisdom and cooperation to see another dawn. When the wolf's song finally faded, Elder Corvin planted his staff more firmly in the earth and spoke with the authority of his great age and accumulated wisdom. The choosing was made 2 nights ago according to our laws, he said solemnly. But tonight another choice must be made, not by ceremony or custom, but by the simple recognition of truth. His ancient eyes swept the circle, meeting each gaze in turn. Who among us will we follow into winter? And more importantly, who among us has the wisdom to know when to lead and when to step aside for the greater good? The question hung in the air like smoke from the sacred fire, and Kira realized that everything, their survival, their future, the very nature of their band, balanced on the edge of the answer. The tension in the sacred circle stretched like sinew ready to snap. Elder Corvin's question hung in the air, while 40 pairs of eyes moved between the 2 men who represented such different visions of leadership. Grok stood rigid with barely controlled rage, his massive frame casting long shadows in the firelight. Thane remained calm beside Kira, one hand resting gently on Shadow's head, while his dark eyes held the steady patience of someone who had learned to wait for wisdom rather than demand immediate action. It was Vera, the sharp-tongued elder, who spoke first. Her weathered voice cut through the silence like a blade through leather. "I remember the great winter," she said, her eyes fixed on some distant memory. 60 days of snow, rivers frozen solid, game scattered to the four winds. My youngest daughter was dying of the fever, and there wasn't enough food to keep a sparrow alive. She turned to look directly at Thane. "You gave her your own portion for 7 days running. Told me it was because you'd eaten earlier, but I knew better. A mother always knows." Her gnarled finger pointed at Grok with the precision of a hunter's spear. "And you, mighty hunter, where were you when the children cried from hunger? Out seeking glory kills while the elders rationed bark soup." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as other memories surfaced. An old man named Theron stepped forward, his bent back straightening with effort. "The cave bear that stalked our hunting grounds," he said, his voice trembling with age but firm with conviction. "It killed 2 of our finest warriors before anyone could bring it down. Everyone said we should abandon the territory, find safer ground." His rheumy eyes found Thane's. "But you tracked it for 3 days through storm and ice, faced it alone in its den rather than risk more lives. And won," added Bren, the young hunter who had witnessed that morning's confrontation. "The scars on your chest, those aren't random wounds. They're from that bear's claws, aren't they?" Thane's hand moved unconsciously to his torso, where the thin fabric of his tunic couldn't quite hide the parallel lines that marked an ancient battle. "The bear is dead," he said quietly. "That's what mattered." But Grok wasn't finished. The massive hunter stepped into the circle's center, his spear planted firmly in the earth like a challenge. "Pretty stories," he snarled. "But stories don't change what happened 3 winters ago. 7 hunters followed you into that ambush, old woman. Only 3 came back alive. Ask Jorik if your hero's wisdom was worth Corin's life. Ask Bran's widow if her husband's death bought anything except guilt for a failed leader." The words hit like physical blows. Several band members shifted uncomfortably, remembering the terrible losses that had ended Thane's leadership. Jorik's face went pale, and his injured leg seemed to buckle slightly under the weight of painful memories. "Corin was my bond brother," he said hoarsely. "We grew up together, learned to hunt together. When the Blackstone warriors surrounded us in that canyon," his voice failed, and for a moment the only sound was the crackling of the sacred fire. Thane stepped forward, his face etched with the same pain that had driven him into exile 3 years ago. "Jorik speaks truth. The responsibility was mine. The failure was mine. Good hunters died because you were betrayed," Jorik interrupted, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Because someone told the Blackstone band exactly where we'd be, exactly when we'd pass through that canyon. Because you trusted when you should have been suspicious." A new tension filled the circle. Betrayal was the darkest of crimes among the hunter-gatherer bands. Worse than cowardice, worse than theft, worse even than murder. To betray the band was to become something less than human. "Who?" Elder Corvin's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Who among us sold our hunters' lives to our enemies?" Jorik's scarred face turned toward Grok with terrible certainty. "Someone who knew our patrol routes. Someone who had access to our battle plans. Someone who stood to gain from Thane's fall." Grok's face went white, then red with fury. "You accuse me of betraying my own band? Me, who has led our hunters to victory after victory." "Victories against weaker prey," Jorik replied coldly. "When did you ever face a real threat? When did you ever risk your own life for the band's survival? You sent others to die in that canyon, then stepped into the leadership you'd helped create through treachery." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Several hunters began backing away from Grok, their faces showing dawning understanding and disgust. But the massive hunter wasn't finished. "Lies!" he roared, raising his spear in both hands. "I challenge this cripple to prove his words with blood. Let the spirits judge who speaks truth." "No." Thane's voice cut through Grok's rage like ice through flesh. "Jorik bears wounds earned in my service. If anyone faces your challenge, it will be me." Kira felt her heart stop. She had seen Thane's skill in the forest clearing, but formal combat was different, bound by rules that might favor Grok's greater size and reach. Before she could speak, however, young Bren stepped forward with the eager courage of youth. "There's another way to settle this," he said, his eyes bright with sudden inspiration. "The old law of the hunt trial. Both claimants take their weapons and go into the deep forest for 3 days. Whoever returns with the most valuable kill leads the band." Elder Corvin nodded slowly, his ancient eyes thoughtful. The hunt trial. It has been many seasons since anyone invoked that right, but the law is clear. Both claimants would face the forest alone, with equal chance to prove their worth through skill rather than pure violence. Grok's face twisted with calculation. He was a formidable hunter when facing normal prey, and 3 days would give him time to set traps, perhaps even arrange another accident for his rival. "I accept," he growled. 3 days in the deep forest. May the strongest hunter return to claim leadership. All eyes turned to Thane, who stood perfectly still beside Kira. She could feel the tension in his lean frame, see the way his dark eyes had gone distant with some internal struggle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of resignation that made her chest ache. "I accept the hunt trial," he said quietly, "but I have one condition." "You're in no position to make conditions," Grok snarled. "Nevertheless," Thane continued, his gaze never leaving Elder Corvin's weathered face, "if I don't return from this trial for whatever reason, I want Kira's safety guaranteed. She chose me in good faith. She shouldn't pay the price for my failures." Kira stepped forward before anyone could answer. "I don't need guarantees," she said firmly. "I need a partner who comes back alive. Don't you dare go into that forest planning to die as penance for something that happened 3 years ago." Their eyes met across the firelight, and she saw something shift in his expression. The weight of old guilt was still there, but beneath it burned something else, a determination that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with protecting what mattered most. "I don't plan to die," he said softly, and for the first time in 3 years, he sounded like he meant it. Elder Corvin struck his ceremonial staff against the earth 3 times, the sound ringing across the clearing like a bell. "Let it be witnessed," he intoned. "Thane of the Redstone Band and Grok of the Redstone Band will undertake the hunt trial beginning with tomorrow's dawn. 3 days in the deep forest, armed only with what they can carry. The hunter who returns with the most valuable kill will lead this band through the winter ahead." As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the coming trial, Mira approached Kira and Thane with worry written across her weathered features. "Child," she said to Kira, "do you understand what you've done? If Thane fails this trial, if Grok returns as leader—" She didn't finish the threat, but everyone understood. Grok's desire for Kira had been clear from the beginning, and leadership would give him the power to claim her regardless of the ceremony's binding. But it was Thane who answered, his voice carrying the quiet confidence she had first heard in the forest clearing. "Grok won't be returning from this trial," he said simply. "At least not as leader. The forest will show the band who truly deserves their trust." As they walked back toward their shelter at the clearing's edge, Shadow trotting beside them with alert amber eyes, Kira found herself looking at Thane with new understanding. The broken outcast was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a hunter who had remembered not just his strength, but his purpose. And that purpose, she was beginning to realize, was no longer just survival. It was protecting the life they were building together. Dawn broke cold and gray over the valley, painting the ancient oaks in shades of silver and shadow. Mist rose from the river like the breath of sleeping spirits, and the first frost of the season glittered on the grass like scattered diamonds. At the edge of the band's territory, 2 hunters prepared for a trial that would determine not just leadership, but the very soul of their people. Thane knelt beside his simple pack, checking each item with the methodical precision of someone who understood that survival depended on preparation, not chance. His weapons were few but perfectly maintained: the obsidian blade that had ended the previous day's confrontation, a smaller skinning knife, a compact bow with 20 arrows, and a selection of snares crafted from braided sinew. His other supplies were equally sparse: water skin, fire-making kit, a small pot for cooking, and several strips of dried meat that would sustain him if hunting failed. Kira watched him prepare with growing anxiety, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Shadow sensed her distress and pressed against her legs, the wolf pup's amber eyes reflecting her worry. "You're traveling light," she observed, noting how little he carried compared to Grok's massive pack of weapons and supplies. "The forest provides for those who know how to ask," Thane replied, securing his pack with practiced efficiency. "Carrying too much makes you slow, and slow hunters become prey." Across the clearing, Grok made a show of testing his arsenal: 3 heavy spears, a massive stone axe, enough weapons to equip a small hunting party. His pack bulged with supplies, and his supporters clustered around him like carrion birds, offering advice and encouragement. The contrast between the 2 hunters couldn't have been more stark. Elder Corvin approached with the ceremonial staff, his ancient face grave with the weight of tradition. Behind him walked the band's other elders, their weathered features showing the accumulated wisdom of countless seasons survived. "By the ancient laws," Corvin intoned, his voice carrying across the misty clearing, "we witness the trial of the hunt. 3 days in the deep forest, armed with skill and courage alone. May the spirits guide both hunters to worthy prey, and may the most deserving lead our people through the winter ahead." He turned first to Grok, who stood with his weapons displayed like trophies. "Grok of the Redstone Band, do you swear by earth and sky to hunt with honor, to face the forest's challenges alone, and to accept the judgment of your kill?" "I swear it," Grok growled, his small eyes glittering with confidence. "And I swear that when I return, this band will remember what true strength looks like." Corvin nodded and turned to Thane, who had risen from his preparations and stood quietly beside Kira. The contrast was even more pronounced now, Grok's brutal confidence against Thane's calm readiness. "Thane of the Redstone Band," the elder continued, "do you swear by earth and sky to hunt with honor, to face the forest's challenges alone, and to accept the judgment of your kill?" "I swear it," Thane replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded absolute loyalty. "And I swear that whatever I face in the deep forest, I will return to honor the choice Kira made." The simple declaration sent a ripple through the watching crowd. This wasn't just about leadership anymore. It was about keeping faith with someone who had believed in him when no one else would. Without ceremony or fanfare, both hunters turned toward the forest's edge. The deep woods beyond the band's territory were a realm of ancient trees and hidden dangers, where predators hunted and prey survived by wit and speed alone. Few members of the band ventured far into that green darkness, and fewer still returned unchanged. Grok plunged into the undergrowth first, his massive frame crashing through the brush with all the subtlety of a charging mammoth. His supporters cheered as he disappeared into the shadows, their voices echoing off the ancient trunks. Thane's departure was different entirely. He paused at the forest's edge to exchange one last look with Kira, his dark eyes holding promises that needed no words. Then he stepped forward and seemed to melt into the green shadows like smoke into wind. One moment he was there, the next he had vanished so completely it was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. 3 days, Kira whispered, more to herself than to the dispersing crowd. 3 days before we know who returns. Mira appeared at her shoulder, the older woman's face etched with worry. "Come, child, there's nothing to do now but wait," and worry never fed the hungry or warmed the cold. But as they walked back toward the band's daily activities, Kira found herself thinking about the way Thane had disappeared into the forest. Not like someone entering foreign territory, but like someone coming home. Deep in the green cathedral of the ancient forest, Thane moved with the fluid grace of a predator in its natural element. Here, where shafts of golden sunlight pierced the canopy to create pools of warmth and shadow, he felt the last remnants of his self-imposed exile falling away like old skin. The forest spoke to those who knew how to listen, and Thane had learned its language during the darkest period of his life. In the months after stepping down as Alpha, when guilt and shame had driven him to seek death among the deep wood's many dangers, he had instead found something else, a connection to the wild world that went deeper than mere hunting skill. He paused beside a stream that sang over moss-covered stones, studying the tracks pressed into the soft mud along its banks. Deer had passed this way at dawn, moving cautiously toward water before retreating to daylight feeding grounds. But there were other marks too, the broad paws of a cave bear, the delicate prints of forest cats, and something else that made him frown with concentration. Wolf tracks, but not from any ordinary pack. These prints were larger than usual, and they moved in the organized formation of hunters who had learned to coordinate their attacks. Dire wolves, perhaps, or the giant wolves that sometimes migrated south when winter came early to the northern mountains. Either way, they represented exactly the kind of dangerous prey that might prove his worth to the band, if he could find them, and if he could survive the encounter. Meanwhile, Grok's progress through the forest sounded like a minor earthquake. Trees snapped under his passage, underbrush crashed and rustled, and his heavy breathing carried for hundreds of yards through the still air. Any prey animal within a day's travel would have ample warning of his approach, but Grok had different plans. He wasn't hunting ordinary game, he was hunting Thane. The massive hunter had spent 3 years thinking about this moment, planning for the day when he could eliminate his rival permanently. The hunt trial provided perfect cover. Accidents happened in the deep forest. Predators killed even the most skilled hunters, and if Thane's body was never found, well, the forest was vast and full of hungry scavengers. Grok had even prepared an alibi. He would return with some impressive but easily obtained kill, perhaps a bear cub whose mother he could track and ambush, and claim to have seen signs of Thane's death. A torn piece of clothing here, blood on a tree trunk there. The band would mourn their fallen hero and accept Grok's leadership as the only alternative to chaos. It was a solid plan, with only one flaw. Thane was no longer the guilt-ridden outcast who had stumbled through the forest like a lost child. The hunter moving through the green shadows now was something far more dangerous, a predator who had remembered not just his skills, but his purpose, and that predator had heard Grok's clumsy approach from nearly a mile away. As evening approached, both hunters made camp in their own distinctive ways. Grok built a large fire and ate heavily from his supplies, confident in his plan and eager to begin tracking his true prey come morning. His massive frame cast long shadows as he sharpened his weapons and imagined the band's reaction to his inevitable victory. Thane's camp was harder to find. He had chosen a natural shelter formed by fallen logs and overhanging stone, concealed from casual observation and defensible from multiple directions. His fire was small and smokeless, its light carefully shielded to avoid attracting attention. As he prepared a simple meal of roasted roots and stream water, Shadow's distant cousins began their evening song, somewhere in the deeper woods. Listening to their wild voices, Thane smiled for the first time since entering the forest. He wasn't the only hunter in these woods with pack instincts and territorial awareness. The trial had begun in earnest, and the deep forest would soon reveal which hunter truly understood its ancient laws. The second day of the trial dawned with the kind of bone-deep cold that warned of winter's early arrival. Frost coated every leaf and branch in the deep forest, turning the ancient woods into a crystalline cathedral that caught and scattered the pale morning light. In this frozen silence, even the slightest sound carried for miles through the still air. Thane had been tracking the dire wolf pack since before dawn, following signs so faint that most hunters would have missed it entirely. These weren't ordinary wolves. They were the legendary giants of the northern mountains, driven south by some disturbance in their traditional hunting grounds. Each animal stood nearly as tall as a man at the shoulder, with jaws that could crush bone and pack instincts honed by thousands of generations of survival. He crouched beside a stream where the pack had stopped to drink, studying the massive paw prints pressed deep into the frozen mud. 7 wolves, including what appeared to be a breeding pair of extraordinary size. They were hunting in the organized formation of apex predators, moving with the confidence of creatures that feared nothing in these woods. Nothing except the hunter who had spent 3 years learning to move like a ghost through their domain. The tracks led deeper into the forest's heart, toward the ancient stone formations that marked the boundary between the known world and the true wilderness. Thane had been there once before, during the darkest days of his exile, when he had sought death among the standing stones and found something else entirely. Today he would return there as a hunter, rather than a broken man seeking oblivion. But he wasn't the only predator stalking through the frozen forest. Grok had given up all pretense of hunting normal prey. His massive frame crashed through the undergrowth like a force of nature, following Thane's trail, with the single-minded determination of a creature that had identified its target. The cold morning air steamed around him as he pushed his powerful body to its limits, driven by 3 years of accumulated rage and humiliation. He had found Thane's first camp shortly after dawn, the carefully concealed shelter, the cold ashes of a smokeless fire, the subtle signs of a hunter who understood concealment better than most warriors understood violence. The discovery had only fed his fury. Even in exile, even broken and defeated, Thane possessed skills that made Grok's own abilities seem clumsy by comparison, but skill meant nothing against overwhelming force, applied without warning. The massive hunter checked his weapons for the dozenth time that morning. 3 heavy spears with obsidian points, sharp enough to punch through cave bear hide, a stone axe with an edge that could split seasoned wood with a single blow, and if those failed, hands strong enough to crush a man's throat without effort. Grok smiled as he imagined the moment of confrontation. Thane would die believing he was the better hunter, never realizing that the true predator had been stalking him since the trial began. The dire wolf pack had made their lair in a natural amphitheater formed by wind-carved stone pillars, where ancient granite thrust up from the earth like the fingers of buried giants. It was a perfect defensive position, multiple escape routes, clear sight lines in all directions, and the kind of terrain that would funnel any attacker into predictable killing grounds. Thane lay motionless on a ledge overlooking the pack's domain, his body pressed flat against stone worn smooth by countless seasons. Below him, the 7 wolves moved with the fluid coordination of a hunting machine, their massive forms radiating the casual confidence of apex predators in their own territory. The alpha male was a monster, even by dire wolf standards, his black coat scarred by battles that would have killed lesser creatures. His mate was nearly as large, her grey fur marked with the distinctive white patches that marked the legendary ghost wolves of the northern peaks. Between them moved 5 younger animals, not quite mature, but already larger than the wolves that occasionally threatened the band's hunting parties. Taking even one of these creatures would provide a trophy worthy of leadership. Taking the alpha pair would establish dominance beyond question, but attempting such a hunt alone bordered on suicide, even for a hunter of Thane's skill, which was why he had no intention of hunting them in any conventional sense. Thane had learned something during his years of exile that no other member of the band understood. The deep forest operated by rules far older than human ambition or pride. Here, survival depended not on dominance, but on understanding your place in the vast web of predator and prey that connected all living things. He reached into his pack and withdrew something he had prepared during the long night. Strips of meat from yesterday's hunting, seasoned with herbs that grew only in the deepest parts of the forest. The wolves' sensitive noses would detect the offering from miles away, and its unusual preparation would mark it as something beyond normal prey. Moving with infinite care, Thane descended from his watching place and approached the stone amphitheater's edge. The wolves had detected his presence. Their ears were forward, their bodies alert but not yet aggressive. They knew he was there, but the scent of the seasoned meat confused their predatory instincts. Slowly, never taking his eyes from the alpha pair, Thane placed the offering on a flat stone within the pack's territory. Then he retreated to a respectful distance and sat cross-legged on the cold ground, his weapons visible but not threatening, and he waited. The alpha male approached first, his massive head low and eyes locked on Thane's face. This was the most dangerous moment. One wrong move, one sign of fear or aggression, and the entire pack would attack as a coordinated unit. But Thane had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable, and he met the dire wolf's gaze with steady calm. The great beast sniffed the offering, then looked back at Thane with intelligence that was almost human. In that moment, hunter and predator recognized each other as equals, 2 apex species sharing the same dangerous world. What happened next would have seemed like magic to most humans, but to Thane, it felt like coming home. The alpha male took the offering and retreated to share it with his pack, but he didn't leave. Instead, the entire pack settled into resting positions around the amphitheater, their presence a clear message. He was accepted here, not as master or servant, but as something rarer, a human who understood the forest's deeper laws. That was when Grok's roar of rage echoed off the ancient stones, shattering the morning's fragile peace. The massive hunter had finally tracked his prey to this remote sanctuary, and what he saw drove him into a fury beyond reason. Thane sat calmly among a pack of dire wolves like some primitive shaman from the old stories, surrounded by creatures that should have torn him apart on sight. "Sorcery!" Grok bellowed, raising his heaviest spear. "Unnatural magic! No true hunter consorts with beasts!" The wolves reacted instantly to the threat, flowing into attack formation with liquid grace. But Thane was faster, rising to his feet with a gesture that somehow held the pack's aggression in check. "Leave, Grok," he called across the stone amphitheater. "You don't belong here. This place operates by laws you'll never understand." "The only law I understand is strength," Grok replied, hefting his spear for a killing throw. "And when you're dead, these beasts will learn what happens to creatures that forget their place." The spear flew with deadly accuracy, its obsidian point aimed directly at Thane's heart. But the slender hunter moved like water, the weapon passing harmlessly through the space he had occupied a heartbeat before. The spear struck stone and shattered, its fragments scattering across the frozen ground. What followed was less a battle than a revelation. Thane moved through the stone amphitheater like a creature born to this wild place, every step perfectly placed, every movement flowing naturally from the last. He wasn't fighting Grok so much as demonstrating the difference between mere strength and true mastery. The massive hunter's remaining weapons met stone or empty air as Thane avoided each attack with minimal effort, and around them both, the dire wolf pack watched with the patient interest of creatures observing a dispute between lesser predators. "You still don't understand," Thane said as Grok's final spear shattered against granite. "Leadership isn't about being the strongest. It's about understanding your place in something larger than yourself." Grok reached for his stone axe, but a low growl from the alpha male made him freeze. The dire wolf had moved closer during the fight, close enough that the massive hunter could feel its breath on his neck. One wrong move, and jaws capable of crushing mammoth bones would end his life instantly. "Choose, brother," Thane said quietly. "Leave this place and return to the band with your life, or stay and face the judgment of creatures that knew these woods before humans learned to make fire." For a long moment, the only sound was Grok's labored breathing and the whisper of wind through ancient stone. Then, with a snarl of frustrated rage, the massive hunter turned and fled deeper into the forest, his pride broken, but his life intact. Thane watched him go, then turned to face the dire wolf alpha with deep respect. The great beast studied him for a moment longer, then did something that would become legend among the Redstone band. He bowed his massive head in recognition of an equal. When Thane finally left the stone amphitheater, he carried with him something far more valuable than any trophy kill, the knowledge that he had found his place in the world's natural order. Behind him, the dire wolf pack continued their ancient vigil, guardians of secrets that few humans would ever understand. The trial was nearly over, but the real test had just begun. The third day of the trial passed with agonizing slowness for those who waited in the valley. Kira found herself constantly scanning the forest's edge, her heart jumping at every shadow that might herald a returning hunter. Shadow, the wolf pup, seemed to sense her anxiety and rarely left her side, his amber eyes reflecting her watchful tension. By evening, when the sacred fire was lit for the judgment ceremony, neither hunter had returned. "The deep forest keeps its own schedule," Elder Corvin observed, settling his ancient bones beside the fire with visible effort. "Great hunts cannot be rushed, and greater truths take time to reveal themselves." But Kira heard the worry in his voice, saw it reflected in the faces of the band members who gathered around the flames. The trial was meant to last 3 days, but tradition demanded that both hunters return by sunset on the third day, or forfeit their claim to leadership. As the sun sank toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, the possibility of neither hunter returning became terrifyingly real. That was when the first figure emerged from the tree line. Grok stumbled into the firelight like a man fleeing demons, his massive frame bent with exhaustion and something else, defeat perhaps, or the kind of bone-deep fear that came from facing something beyond comprehension. His weapons were gone, his pack torn and nearly empty. Scratches covered his arms and face, and his clothes hung in tatters from his powerful frame. But it was his eyes that told the real story. The small, predatory gleam that had marked him as a dominant hunter was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who had seen his own mortality reflected in forces he couldn't control or understand. "Grok!" Vera called out, her sharp voice cutting through the evening air. "Where is your kill? Where is the proof of your worthiness to lead?" The massive hunter stopped at the circle's edge, swaying slightly on his feet. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "There is no kill," he admitted, the words seeming to tear from his throat. "The deep forest, it holds creatures that no hunter can claim, things that judge us, rather than serving as our prey." A murmur of confusion ran through the gathered band. The trial was about bringing back the most impressive kill, proof of hunting prowess, that would demonstrate leadership qualities. What Grok described made no sense within their traditional understanding. "Then you forfeit your claim?" Elder Corvin asked, his ancient voice carrying the weight of absolute law. Grok's jaw worked silently for a moment, his pride warring with the undeniable truth of his failure. Finally he nodded once, a sharp movement that seemed to cut something loose inside him. "I forfeit," he said, and the words seemed to age him by 10 years. That was when the second figure appeared. Thane walked out of the forest shadows with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. But he wasn't alone. Padding beside him, matching his pace with perfect coordination, came a sight that froze every person around the sacred fire in stunned amazement. The dire wolf pup was young, perhaps 4 months old, but already showed the size and distinctive markings that marked it as one of the legendary giants of the northern peaks. Its coat was jet black except for silver markings around its eyes and paws, and when it looked at the gathered humans, its gaze held an intelligence that was almost unsettling. But it was the pup's behavior that truly shocked the watching band. It stayed close to Thane's left side, alert but unafraid, its body language speaking of trust and mutual respect rather than the fear or aggression that should mark any interaction between human and wild predator. "By the ancestors," breathed Jorik, his scarred face pale with amazement. He's bonded with one of the giant wolves. Thane approached the sacred fire with quiet confidence, the dire wolf pup maintaining perfect formation beside him. When he reached the circle's edge, he knelt and placed something on the ground before Elder Corvin. Not a kill or trophy, but a collar of sorts, woven from grasses that grew only in the deepest parts of the forest and marked with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. "I bring no kill," he said simply, his voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering, "but I bring something more valuable, proof that the deep forest has accepted me as guardian rather than invader." Elder Corvin leaned forward, studying the woven collar with eyes that had seen many strange things in his long life. The symbols worked into the grass seemed familiar somehow, reminiscent of the old cave paintings that marked sacred sites throughout their territory. "Explain," the elder commanded, his voice carrying genuine curiosity along with authority. Thane's hand moved to rest gently on the dire wolf pup's head, and the young predator leaned into his touch with obvious trust. "The giant wolf pack of the northern mountains has been driven from their territory by something. Earthquake, fire, or human incursion, I couldn't determine which. They've taken refuge in the sacred stone circle at the forest's heart." He paused, his dark eyes moving around the circle to meet each person's gaze in turn. "I found them there. 7 adults and this youngster. By all rights, they should have killed me for entering their sanctuary. Instead, they tested me, judged me, and found me acceptable." "Acceptable how?" Vera demanded, her sharp voice breaking the spell of wonder that had settled over the gathering. "As someone who understands that true strength comes from knowing your place in the natural order," Thane replied. "As someone who can protect rather than exploit, guide rather than dominate." He gestured to the dire wolf pup, which looked up at him with obvious affection. "This young one's mother was killed by whatever drove the pack from their mountains. The adults accepted my offer to foster him until he's old enough to return to his people, if he chooses to. In return, they granted me this." Thane touched the woven collar, and several band members gasped as they finally recognized the symbols. They were the same markings found in the oldest cave paintings, the ones that depicted the legendary First Alliance between humans and wolves that had allowed both species to survive the great ice ages. "The pack leaders marked me as a guardian of the ancient compact," Thane continued, "someone who can serve as a bridge between the human world and the deep forest, ensuring that both can coexist without destroying each other." The implications hit the gathered band like a physical blow. Leadership based not on dominance but on balance. Strength measured not by what you could kill, but by what you could protect. It was a completely different way of understanding power, and it challenged everything they thought they knew about survival in the harsh world. Elder Corvin struggled to his feet, his ceremonial staff trembling in his gnarled hands. The ancient man stared at Thane for a long moment, then at the dire wolf pup that had somehow become a symbol of something far greater than any hunt trial. "The forest has chosen," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Not through violence or death, but through recognition of true wisdom. Thane of the Redstone Band, the spirits of the deep woods have marked you as guardian and guide. Do you accept the leadership they offer?" Thane looked across the fire to where Kira stood watching with tears streaming down her face. In her expression, he saw not just love, but pride in who he had become. The broken outcast was truly gone, replaced by someone who could lead not through fear, but through understanding. "I accept," he said quietly, "but not as the Alpha I once was, as something new, a leader who serves the balance between human needs and natural law." The dire wolf pup lifted its head and released a howl that seemed to come from the very heart of the wilderness. The sound was answered from the deep forest, first by one voice, then many, until the entire pack sang their approval across the miles. As the wild chorus echoed off the valley walls, Kira broke from the circle and ran to Thane's side. He caught her in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed through her tears, and for a moment the serious business of leadership was forgotten in the simple joy of reunion. But when they separated, both of them were aware that everything had changed. The desperate girl who had kissed an outcast to avoid being claimed was gone, replaced by the bondmate of a guardian who held responsibilities that stretched far beyond any single band's survival. And the bitter exile who had sought death in the deep forest had found something far more valuable, a purpose that would define not just his own future, but the future of everyone who chose to follow him into the challenging seasons ahead. The trial was over, but their real journey was just beginning. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the northern mountains like a hungry predator seeking prey. By the time the moon had waned twice since the hunt trial, snow lay thick across the valley, and ice sealed the smaller streams with crystal armor. It was the kind of harsh season that tested every bond, every alliance, every decision made in easier times. But the Redstone Band had never been better prepared for winter's challenges. Under Thane's guidance, their approach to survival had transformed completely. Where Grok had focused on stockpiling through dominance, taking what they needed from weaker groups and defending it through force, Thane built networks of mutual aid that stretched across the entire valley system. The dire wolf pup, now called Storm for the silver markings that resembled lightning across his dark coat, had grown rapidly under the combined care of Thane and Kira. At 6 months old, he was already larger than most adult wolves, and his presence had opened doors that no amount of traditional diplomacy could have achieved. The Riverstone Band agrees to share their fish preserves, Jorik reported as he returned from a diplomatic mission, his injured leg more manageable now that he traveled by sledge rather than on foot. In exchange, we provide them with the cave bear pelts they need for winter clothing. Thane nodded, marking the agreement on a piece of bark where he tracked the complex web of alliances he had woven throughout the region. Storm lifted his massive head from where he had been napping beside the fire, amber eyes alert to every nuance of the conversation. "And the Blackstone Band?" Thane asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Jorik's scarred face darkened. "They refuse all contact. Their new leader, Vask, claims we've been corrupted by unnatural alliances. He's been raiding the smaller bands, taking their winter stores by force." It was the challenge Thane had been expecting since taking leadership. Not every group would accept his revolutionary approach to survival, and the Blackstone Band had always been the most aggressive of their neighbors. Under Vask's leadership, they had become little more than organized raiders, taking what they needed from others rather than developing sustainable relationships. Kira looked up from where she was teaching young Nala to weave warming mats from marsh grass, her face troubled. "They attacked the Willowbrook families 2 days ago," she said quietly, "burned their stores, scattered their hunters. The survivors are seeking refuge with anyone who will take them." "How many survivors?" Thane asked, though he was already calculating shelter space and food distribution in his mind. 15 adults, 8 children, Kira replied, including 3 nursing mothers and an elder who can barely walk. Traditional band logic would have rejected such a burden. 23 additional mouths to feed during the harshest winter in memory, including many who couldn't contribute to hunting or gathering efforts. It was exactly the kind of decision that would have made Grok refuse any alliance. But Thane had learned different lessons during his years of exile. "Send word that they're welcome here," he said without hesitation. "We'll make room." "Thane," Vera interjected, her sharp voice carrying a note of concern, "we're already stretched thin. Taking in that many refugees could mean starvation for everyone. Or it could mean the difference between surviving winter and thriving through it," he replied calmly. "The Willowbrook people are master crafters. Their leatherwork and tool-making could improve our equipment significantly. Their children can be taught our ways while adding fresh blood to our gene pool. And their elder, Grandmother Senna, knows plant lore that could save lives when the healing supplies run low." He stood and moved to the fire's edge, Storm rising to pad alongside him with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. In the months since the hunt trial, the bond between human and wolf had deepened beyond anything the band had ever witnessed. They moved together, hunted together, and seemed to communicate through subtle gestures that needed no words. "More importantly," Thane continued, "helping them sends a message to every band in the region. We're not just another group of scavengers fighting over scraps. We're building something new, a network of mutual support that makes everyone stronger." Elder Corvin, who had been listening from his place of honor beside the main fire, struck his ceremonial staff against the frozen ground. The sharp sound drew everyone's attention to the ancient man's weathered face. "The young guardian speaks wisdom," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades. "But wisdom without strength is just noble failure. What happens when Vask decides our corruption threatens his way of life? What happens when the Blackstone Raiders come not for scattered families, but for us?" It was the question that had haunted Thane's thoughts since taking leadership. His new model of cooperation and balance was powerful, but it required time to establish deep roots. If Vask moved against them before those roots were secure, everything they had built could crumble in a single violent confrontation. "Then we defend ourselves," Thane replied simply, "but not the way Grok would have, not through superior brutality or dominance." He gestured toward the forest's edge, where keen eyes might spot movement in the shadowy spaces between the ancient trees. Storm's packmates visit us regularly now. They've accepted our alliance as beneficial to both species. If the Blackstone Raiders attack, they won't face just human defenders. As if summoned by his words, a low howl echoed from the deep forest, not threatening but clearly present. Several band members shivered despite the fire's warmth, remembering the primal fear that giant wolves evoked in human hearts. But young Nala, who had been playing with Storm since he was small enough to curl up in her lap, simply smiled and waved toward the sound. "Hello, big cousins," she called out cheerfully. The innocent greeting broke the tension, reminding everyone that what seemed terrifying to enemies had become familiar and protective to those who embraced the new compact. "There's something else," Jorik added, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. The Willowbrook survivors brought news. Vask isn't just raiding randomly. He's been gathering the most aggressive hunters from multiple bands, promising them rich rewards for joining his war party. Thane felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with winter air. "How many?" "Perhaps 30 warriors," Jorik replied grimly, "all of them chosen for their willingness to kill without question. He's planning something big, not just another raid, but a campaign to eliminate what he sees as the threat to traditional ways." The implications were staggering. 30 experienced warriors represented a force capable of overwhelming any single band, no matter how well prepared. It was exactly the kind of overwhelming violence that had shaped the old ways of survival. Take what you need, destroy what threatens you. Never show weakness that enemies could exploit. But Thane had learned something during his years in the deep forest that Vask couldn't understand. Sometimes the greatest strength came from appearing vulnerable, while actually being prepared for challenges your enemies couldn't imagine. "How long before they're ready to move?" he asked. "The refugees think perhaps a half-moon," Jorik replied. "Maybe less if the weather improves enough for travel." Thane nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities and preparations. Storm pressed against his leg with warm reassurance, and he could feel the complex web of alliances and relationships he had built throughout the region, not just with other human bands, but with the natural world itself. "Then we have time," he said finally. "Time to prepare, time to strengthen what we've built, and time to show Vask that the old ways aren't the only ways to survive." He turned to face the gathered band members, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight with steady confidence. "Send messengers to all our allied bands. Tell them what's coming, and remind them why they chose cooperation over conquest. And send word to the Willowbrook refugees. They're not just seeking shelter anymore, they're joining something worth defending." Kira rose from her teaching place and moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his with natural ease. Storm positioned himself between them, amber eyes alert and intelligent, as he surveyed the circle of humans who had become his pack. In that moment, watching his people prepare for the challenges ahead, Thane felt something he hadn't experienced since before the disastrous hunt 3 winters ago. Not just confidence in his own abilities, but trust in the strength of what they had built together. The old compact between human and wolf had been forged in the Ice Ages, when both species learned that cooperation meant survival, while isolation meant death. Now, facing the threat of those who would destroy everything they had accomplished, it was time to discover if that ancient alliance could triumph once again over the forces of destruction. Winter was far from over, and the greatest test still lay ahead. The attack came with the false dawn, when the world lay suspended between night's darkness and morning's light. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes that muffled sound and blurred vision, providing perfect cover for 30 Blackstone warriors as they crept toward the Redstone Band's winter settlement. Vask led his war party with the confidence of a predator stalking helpless prey. In his mind, the corrupted band ahead represented everything wrong with the changing world: weakness disguised as wisdom, unnatural alliances that violated the pure laws of survival. His warriors moved behind him like shadows, their weapons ready, and their hearts hardened by promises of rich rewards taken from the defeated. They expected to find sleeping families, perhaps a few drowsy guards who could be eliminated quietly before the real slaughter began. What they found instead was an empty settlement. "Where are they?" snarled Jorak, Vask's most trusted lieutenant, as he kicked through the cold ashes of what should have been a thriving fire pit. The shelters stood intact but vacant, as if their occupants had simply vanished into the winter night. Vask's scarred face twisted with suspicion. His small, cruel eyes scanned the abandoned camp, noting details that made his warrior's instincts scream warnings. The evacuation had been too complete, too organized. No forgotten tools, no scattered belongings, no signs of panic or hasty flight. "Trap," he growled, raising his massive war axe. "They knew we were coming." That was when the howling began. It started as a single voice echoing from the forest's depths, low, haunting, and filled with a power that made even the most hardened warriors shift nervously. But the sound was quickly joined by others, until the entire valley rang with the ancient song of the giant wolves. "Just animals," Jorak muttered, but his knuckles were white on his spear shaft. "Nothing we can't handle." Vask was about to agree when the first eyes appeared in the swirling snow, amber points of light that reflected an intelligence far beyond any ordinary predator. Then more eyes and more, until the war party found themselves surrounded by a ring of massive forms that seemed to materialize from the winter storm itself. 7 dire wolves, each one large enough to bring down a cave bear, stood in perfect formation around the abandoned camp. Their alpha, a black giant with silver markings, stepped forward with fluid grace and fixed Vask with a stare that seemed to reach into his very soul. "Sorcery," whispered one of the younger warriors, his voice cracking with barely controlled fear. "Unnatural magic." But Vask had not survived to lead 30 warriors by believing in magic over steel. "Just beasts," he roared, though his own voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Dangerous ones, but still just beasts. Form ranks. Spears forward." The Blackstone warriors obeyed with the discipline of men trained for violence, but their formation was tight with fear. Dire wolves were legend made flesh, creatures from the old stories that parents used to frighten children into obedience. To face one was terror enough. To face 7 was beyond their worst nightmares. That was when Thane stepped out of the swirling snow. He moved with the same fluid grace as the wolves around him, his lean form wrapped in furs that seemed to blend with the winter storm. Storm padded beside him, now grown nearly to full size and bearing the unmistakable markings of his legendary bloodline. Behind them came the rest of the Redstone band, not fleeing refugees, but prepared defenders who had used the abandoned camp as bait to draw their enemies into chosen ground. "Vask of the Blackstone band," Thane called across the tense space between them, his voice carrying clearly despite the falling snow. "You've come far from your territory. State your business in our valley." Vask's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone. "My business is ending the corruption you've spread, false guardian. These lands belong to the strong, not to those who consort with beasts and coddle the weak." "These lands belong to no one," Thane replied calmly. "They are shared by all who understand their place in the natural order. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You only know taking, not giving. Conquest, not cooperation." "Say pretty words from a dead man," Vask snarled, raising his war axe. "Kill them all, take what they've hoarded. Let the wolves feast on their corpses." The battle that followed was unlike anything the valley had ever witnessed. Vask's warriors were skilled and experienced, hardened by years of raiding and conquest, but they had trained to fight other humans, creatures bound by the same physical limitations, the same predictable tactics, the same mortal vulnerabilities. They had never faced an enemy that moved in perfect coordination with apex predators. Thane flowed through the combat like water finding its natural course, his obsidian blade catching what little light penetrated the storm. But he wasn't fighting alone. Storm moved beside him like a shadow given form, cutting off escape routes and creating openings for his human partner to exploit. Around them, the dire wolf pack struck with surgical precision, targeting weapons and legs rather than going for immediate kills. It was a dance of violence and restraint, deadly efficiency tempered by an intelligence that sought to disable rather than destroy. The Blackstone warriors, trained for brutality but not for this kind of coordinated assault, began to falter almost immediately. Their formation broke as men found themselves facing enemies that moved like no human opponent ever could. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire, and with panic came the kind of mistakes that turned skilled fighters into vulnerable prey. But it was the arrival of the allied bands that truly broke Vask's war party. From the forest's edge came the Riverstone hunters, their faces painted with the blue clay that marked them as defenders of the sacred waters. From the southern approaches appeared the surviving Willowbrook warriors, their weapons gleaming with the superior craftsmanship that had made their band legendary. Even some of the smaller family groups had sent their best fighters, creating a coalition that surrounded the Blackstone raiders completely. "You see, Vask?" Thane called across the chaos of battle, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the sounds of combat. "This is what cooperation builds. Not just individual strength, but collective power that makes everyone stronger. Vask's response was a roar of pure fury as he charged directly at Thane, his massive war axe cutting deadly arcs through the falling snow. He was a formidable opponent, larger than Thane, brutally experienced, and driven by the desperate fury of a predator who had finally met something beyond his ability to dominate. The duel that followed would be remembered in songs and stories for generations to come. Vask fought with the savage intensity of the old ways, seeking to overwhelm through pure aggression and superior size. Thane moved with the fluid wisdom of the new compact, turning his opponent's strength against him, while Storm circled them both like a protective spirit. It ended when Vask overextended himself in a killing blow that would have split Thane from shoulder to hip. Instead of retreating, Thane stepped inside the attack, his smaller blade finding the gap in Vask's defenses with surgical precision. The Blackstone leader fell to his knees in the blood-stained snow, his war axe tumbling from nerveless fingers. "Yield," Thane said quietly, his blade at Vask's throat but not yet cutting. "Your warriors are defeated. Your cause is lost. There's no shame in choosing survival over pointless death." For a moment, Vask's eyes blazed with the kind of hatred that would never accept defeat. But as he looked around at his scattered war party, some dead, some wounded, most simply kneeling in surrender, reality crashed over him like a frozen wave. He had brought 30 of the finest warriors from multiple bands, armed them with the best weapons, and led them against what he believed was a corrupted group of weaklings. Instead, he had walked into a trap that demonstrated just how completely the world had changed. "I yield," he whispered, the words seeming to tear from his throat like pieces of his soul. Thane stepped back, lowering his weapon with the same fluid grace that had marked all his movements. Around them, the sounds of battle faded as the surviving Blackstone warriors laid down their arms and accepted the protection of the allied bands. "The old ways aren't wrong, Vask," Thane said as healers moved to tend the wounded from both sides. "Strength and courage and the will to fight, these things still matter, but strength without wisdom is just destruction. Courage without compassion is just cruelty. And the will to fight means nothing if you don't know what you're fighting for." He gestured toward the mixed groups of humans and wolves who were working together to care for the injured, share food with hungry prisoners, and begin the complex process of integrating former enemies into the new order. "This is what I fight for," he continued. "Not dominance, but balance. Not conquest, but survival for everyone who's willing to accept their place in something larger than themselves." Vask looked up at him with eyes that held the first glimmer of understanding. "And if some refuse to accept, then they make their own choices and live with the consequences," Thane replied simply. "But the invitation remains open always. The forest has room for all who come in peace." As the winter storm began to clear, revealing a valley transformed by the morning's events, Kira appeared at Thane's side with the easy grace of a true partner. Storm pressed against them both, his massive head tilted, as if listening to sounds only he could hear. "The pack leaders are calling." The dire wolf seemed to communicate through gestures that needed no words. His amber eyes looked toward the deep forest, where ancient powers waited to witness the outcome of this day's work. "Then we should answer," Thane said, understanding flowing between them like water finding its course. Together, human, wolf, and the woman who had chosen to bind her life to both, they walked toward the forest's edge. Behind them, the allied bands began the work of building something unprecedented in the harsh world of the Ice Age, a community based not on dominance and fear, but on cooperation and mutual respect. The broken outcast who had once sought death in the deep woods was gone forever, replaced by the guardian of a new compact between human ambition and natural wisdom. The desperate girl who had kissed him to avoid being claimed had become the bondmate of someone who would reshape the very meaning of leadership. And in the ancient forest where dire wolves sang their approval to the winter sky, the spirits of the ancestors smiled upon a union that promised survival not just for one band or one season, but for all the generations yet to come. Winter would end eventually, bringing new challenges and new opportunities. But whatever came, they would face it together, human and wolf, individual strength and collective wisdom, the ancient laws and the new covenant that honored both tradition and change. In choosing each other, Thane and Kira had chosen a future where love and partnership could triumph over force and domination, and in that choice lay the seeds of a world where both species could thrive in harmony with the eternal rhythms of the natural world. The ceremony of choosing was finally truly complete.